welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be talking about how to draw the rhino that we sketched out last week. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here's the rhino that we sketched out last week, so now we're going to finish it out. It's going to be kind of a brownish gray, and the horn is going to be gray, but a little grayer. Rhinos are pretty unicolored. So we're going to have all the lines kind of coming down but contouring, right? So by that I mean I'm still drawing down this way, and then we'll add oopsies, shadows and highlights to indicate wrinkling. And then, as always, being careful by the eyes. And then he's got, the little eyelid as well. And pulling it kind of down. So there's no midpoint because of the horn. So it's just building up these lines. You can see I'm kind of contouring it. Then you have, of course, the nostrils. And we'll do a little contouring here too, where we run some lines into it and some we sort of swoop around them. But we're still going to have the lines all going in the same direction. That's going to help avoid line conflicts. Now, it doesn't have fur, so while we don't have to be perfectly careful on the edge of the face, I'm mindful of the fact that there's no fur there, so I don't want to go as crazy as I might with, an animal that has fur, and it doesn't matter as much. Leaving the eyebrow blank, and then, angling these strokes off to the side as we come up, and then, kind of angling those out, right? Doesn't matter, there's no fur length or anything here. And then you have, the ear. And we'll be following, the contour of the ear for the inside too. For now, bringing this up to the edge and over. So to get the ear, right, it's gonna slowly fade as we get closer and closer to the center. Right, so we have kind of this looping that we're going to still do. But then we're going to fade that out. So I'm not going to bring this all the way over. I have some of that coming in. But right as I pop that off, we're going to use shadows and highlights to really define that. But right, still bringing this down. This is going to have some shadowing, but none of that matters right now. Coming down to the lip, where we're going to stop the strokes. See how we're stopping those strokes, although continuing next to, and then underneath it, continuing those strokes again, right? And potentially in a slightly different direction, right? So the chin's coming out, so we'll jut it out that way. That'll help give some indication that there's some differences happening. Do the same thing on this side, right? As we bring this down, this will come straight down and stop. And then over here, we're angling it just a little bit. It'll create that change. And here, just like on the other side, we're still angling those for the nostrils before we bring it down. So bring that straight down. Run into the nostril, and then loop it just that bit, and then coming back to be straight down. All of that's going to show some contouring on his face, and then bringing over. Right, so we have all that. That'll also be clear. Be easier to see once we add highlights and shadows, but it'll be even clearer. So I'm going to finish out this side of his face doing the same thing we did on this one. And I will be right back. So that one's pretty straightforward. I'm going to get the horn real fast. Orange just a different color, but otherwise this is straightforward. It's just literally bringing this down, right? So I'm going to get the horn real fast, and I will be right back. That's how we have it going right now. Okay, so highlights and shadows. I'm going to have the light source coming from above and to the right. As always, that means above and in front of, not behind or next to. So there are some shadows to consider, and we'll do those first. Right, we have some wrinkling under the eyes, so this is just light pin pressure. As we get that little bit happening, I have a little wrinkling in here. And then all edges are in shadow, so this whole edge of his face, pop this off to see better. Whole edge of his face, but I don't want to draw over. Yeah, that's fine. Is going to be in shadow. Right, so we follow that contour up as his head comes up. And then, you know, the whole side down this way be in shadow. I want to make sure it's straight, but I also don't want to miss anything, which is why I keep popping that sketch layer on and off. Right, so it's not a deep shadow, but that's how, you know, you apply depth to things depending on where the light source is. Now, if the light source were directly on the side, that wouldn't be the case, right? This would be in highlight, but it's not directly on the side. It's in front of, which means there's some shadowing on the side of the light source. Right, then of course there's shadowing on the other side, right? We have the little bit of shadowing that we get from the wrinkles under the eyes, but a big chunk of this backside, plus where the horn's coming off, right? If it's above and in front of, you know, if you have that angle coming in, then you have the horn here, which would be blocking some of this kind of going back at an angle, but it's going to run into the shadow of the face as that kind of kicks in. Right, so we have that kind of coming up. And then the side of the face. Now some of this we'll be doing in highlight. However, it can be easier to do a whole swath in shadow, as you know, as you probably know, because I do it all the time. So a big chunk in shadow. Making sure to stay somewhat in some consistent lines. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm bringing that down. And then, you know, of course we have the shadow over here. So right now it's kind of all looking interesting because we're only adding shadow, but as we add, you know, highlight, this will look a lot different. It's kind of looking a certain way because of how the shadow is the only thing kind of here at the moment. Okay, so then I'm going to do the whole chin here, and you can see because of how we drew, I can see that. Right, and I'm going to do the whole thing in shadow. We will be adding some highlights to this, but whole chin in shadow. The only thing I don't know is where the mouth ends. Right there, okay. Because I will be shadowing, you know, it'll go into shadow right where the mouth meets. But in between that, before you go all the way under, there's going to be some highlight in that middle. It's just a small space, right? And I find it easier to add shadow before I add the highlight. So the highlight, you know, it's easier to add highlight in this style than it is to take it away. So this is one of those cases, right? So, and that's because of how we do it, right? This is just backed off pin pressure, whereas the highlight is full pin pressure, so it makes it look a lot different, and therefore is harder to undo once you commit to it. Right, okay, so chin all in shadow. Now we're gonna have some shadowing with the nostrils, if I can get it right. Right, you have kind of that back side that's going to be getting some shadow. You have some wrinkles that'll be getting some shadow. Underneath will be getting some shadow. Then the top of the nostril, where it goes in and even around on the side, would be in shadow. This is away from that light source. We have some shadow over here, and this is probably kicking in to shadow on the side over here. Come down the face. Okay, so over here, same thing. We have some shadowing where we have that loop. We have shadowing underneath where there's a bulge, basically. Some shadowing up in here and around, and then shadowing just above the nostril itself and off to the side, as opposed to highlight, which will be on the other side. Some shadowing here, and then we're going to have some shadowing, some wrinkling right where his nose is. I'm going to do a little bit of wrinkling up in here too. Whether or not I stick to this remains to be seen. But that's just that light pin pressure. Be easier to get all of that in. And then right, all edges are in shadow, so there's a shadowing above on the head too. And on the ears. Right, so you have that head coming up. All that's in shadow. And then on the other side, same thing. All that's in shadow. Right, and then the ears, shadow, especially on that back side. Might be a little highlight on the front, but yeah, okay. That back side. And then all edges are in shadow, but for the most part, this one will be in highlight. And then, you know, you have the edge of the ear. Oh, right, and then all of these shadows real fast. Just wrinkling. Okay. We'll get some here as well. In between his mouth. Now there will be some shadowing along the bottom of the lip. Right, his lip's curving inward, so there's inevitably some shadow here. His lip curves down. We might have to sort of sort out the shadows against the lip a little later because of that. And then, you know, you kind of have this little bit of shadowing I'm going to do here where this dips into his face just a little bit. Okay. Now, so we have that, but to make the highlights, it's full pin pressure, right? So that's full pin pressure, and that really changes how that looks, right? Making sure I have the edge of the horn nice and sorted. But see, the reason I like to do it this way is now all my shadows are for the most part taken care of. I don't have to think about that. Now I can just, you know, do full pin pressure to draw the rest of the Rhino in, and I don't really have to worry about, you know, double checking, making sure everything's all right, except to make sure that I'm not drawing into the horn. Other than that, relatively straightforward. Full pin pressure. Now, you know, in addition to full pin pressure adding a highlight, you can also do it with adding more lines. So, you know, in some of these areas that are shadowed, adding more lines will brighten it up as well. Right down here, if I want to add a highlight, I don't have to put more pin pressure, because I will want to add this in highlight, right? You can see just adding more lines is doing that too. So that's why I will do it this way. Sometimes I just have more control when I'm doing it this way. Instead of adding the full pin pressure, I'm still getting that tapered edge. But more lines, more pin pressure, both of those are a way to add highlight in. Alright, so I'm going to finish out his face in highlight. Since everything else is highlight, we've already talked through the shadows, and I will be right back. Alright, so now that we've sketched in the face, I am going to make some quick changes here. Just tempering off that line. It's a bit dramatic, where that highlight comes down just a bit too much. Or too harshly, I should say. Okay. Now, I'm going to readjust a little bit on this eyebrow because the other one's a bit thinner, so we're going to thin this one out just that little bit, just to put it on par with the other one. Then we also have, like, those wrinkles are looking a bit much. So, we are going to temper them out just a little bit too, right? First, narrow them in so that they look more wrinkle-like. Right, really narrow that out. And if there's two, you know, separating it. It's fine if it is, but it won't look like wrinkles if they're too thick. So giving them kind of room to breathe on their own. It's easy enough to do. But then we're also going to draw over them a bit, brighten them up to lighten them a bit. Make them not quite as deep. However, you know, the shadows and highlights will kind of indicate how deep or not deep a wrinkle is, or recess. Right, so the lighter the so if I brighten these up, they won't seem as deep as they are now. They'll still be there, right? You can still see them, but it makes them a little bit more, makes them less deep, makes them less prominent. Just enough that they're there. Okay. Now, we're going to move on to the ears, right? So we have, you know, the ear coming down, all edges are in shadow, so we still have that true here. So we still have that, you know, all edges are in shadow, so that's still true here on the ear. On the front and the back. The back's going to have a bigger shadow than the front though. And then we're going to have a bit of a burst, just a second, right through here on that ear. A little bit on that front side, but not fully. Right, and then tapering that off. Because then you have, you know, this part of the ear coming down too, and it's just kind of going to be fading out a bit. Right as we have the ear coming up. And I did this very lightly intentionally, but there will be some highlighting on this section of the ear on this inside, because that would be catching some light. But it's going to quickly fade away as we get towards the center of the ear. Kind of that idea. You have kind of that edge, and then you know, as we move towards the center, it'll fade out. You can see I'm kind of drawing a little bit inward, so I'm not on the edge. It makes it a little easier. Come to this point here. It's okay for that angle to shift. We'll have a little bit of this on this side too. Both sides, based on how that ear, you know, through here you need to think about how that light source is hitting. Based on how the ear's angled, how's that light going to be hitting? And both sides be catching just that little bit of light. But then, you know, as we move deeper and deeper into the ear, the more this is going to be tapering off, right? So we'll eventually move into black. I'm putting obviously less pin pressure, but less strokes. That's how we're going to make that happen. Still layering them in between each other, but less strokes. And that'll make it look like it's fading. But we're going to add just a little bit of highlight to some of this as well. I'm not adding more pin pressure to do this, I'm just adding more strokes to brighten it up. It'll give me more control over how much I'm doing on this ear. Right, light source coming from above and to the right, so you'd have that light really pushing in and then fading out. Alright, so that's one side. And we have the other. Right on this side, you're going to have certainly that edge shadow and the opposite edge in shadow, but for the most part this ear will be in highlight because that would be picking up a good chunk of light based on this angle. Right, light source coming from above and to the right, so all that sun is hitting right there. And then, you know, this one will be in more shadow than the other side. Just making sure that the edge is straight. There's probably still some light that this edge is picking up, because the way the ears are shaped, it's probably just sort of picking up a little bit on that edge, just like the other side was, interestingly. But we need to start the process of pulling away a lot sooner. Right, so we need to really be fading it. And there'd be much more of a shadow on the closer side, because this would definitely be blocking. It would only be picking up on that other one, on that other side. Right, so just sort of barely having that in. And we'll have just that little bit of highlight kicking in over here. Again, just a little, not going to be anything big. All right. Gonna fix this edge real fast. Just, it was fine the way it was, but you can kind of see it changed how it looked a little bit when I did that. Just making sure that, you know, this looks like it's all more in highlight than what's happening on this backside. Because, well, it should be more in highlight than what's happening way over here. All right. Now for the horn, which we've done a little bit more grayish or desaturated. Horn relatively straightforward. Right, you have this big sort of triangular shaped object in the middle of his head, and so we'll highlight and shadow that accordingly, which means I'm going to do the whole thing in shadow. So I'll do the whole horn in shadow, just following those straight lines down, you know, straight from the tip down to the base. And I will be right back. It's that backed off pin pressure. So I'll be right back. All right, so now that we got his horn in place, we need to sort out the highlights versus the shadows. So, you know, we'll have certainly highlight coming in through here. All edges are in shadow, so push the highlight over, but I'm not going to go all the way over off the edge of the nose, because that edge of the nose would be in shadow. But we want to blend it in. It's partly what I'm doing, making sure it's nice and blended in. And then as we come up under, there's a little dip where it's going under the nose. So that once again is going into shadow. Making sure this is nice and tight up in here. Okay, and then as we're coming across, certainly the middle would be highlight. Right, so that's down this way, it's all highlight till you get to the bottom. And then as we start bringing it over, probably still a little highlight bleeding just this bit because of the angle, that light source. Now we're going to start tapering it off. Sometimes I have trouble aiming my strokes, so I'll just zoom in and do it this way. Not going to dodge me when I do that. Alright, so just backing that off, giving myself a nice big runway to back off my strokes and my pin pressure. And making sure, you know, I have just enough room to make it all blended in. Just like I will underneath as well. Right, so it helps on something big like this because you can draw all the way down because you want that blending to happen in the same spot all the way over. So just following that line down totally works. Right, and then just filling the rest of this in with that brighter highlight. But tapering it off as well as we come underneath. And then if I need to, I can add a brighter highlight, whether I add white or I just brighten up what's already here. You know, the thing about this style is if I want to add more, it is relatively easy to do. If I want to make it brighter somewhere, I just add more lines and that typically brightens it up. Right, bring that over, taper it off. All right, so if I want to brighten this up, I would brighten it right where I think that harsh light would be hitting, which would be somewhere in here. Right, and you can see that makes a difference where I'm putting more lines, more pin pressure even, and really brightening up a section can make a big difference in how that shadow's coming along, right? Because he's, you know, the rhinos, their horn is nice and rounded, so you want it to give that impression. There's not a whole lot else blocking or hindering how something would look, so you want kind of a nice uniform roundness to it. I mean, there's divots typically in the horns themselves, so that's not unusual, but okay. Well, now we have the eyes. So I don't think I set out the eyes. I didn't. I'm going to come down here and do that. We're going to do brown for the eyes. It's usually what color eyes are. So I'm just going to scribble that in on my sketch layer down here. And I'm going to come up here. I'm going to leave this in place for the moment because I need to know where the iris versus the whites of the eyes are. I'm just going to circle out the iris real fast. Right, and that's just following that edge so that when I take that off, that's there, and I can add the white. Okay. So white of the eye. You know, usually you wouldn't do this. I'm doing it because it's cartoon, and typically on cartoonish animals, you have this kind of effect where you can, you know, seeing the whites of the eyes makes them seem more human, and that's the whole point of sort of cartoonizing. Is that a word? Should be a word. Something is you're humanizing it. Although rhinos are pretty cute without it, but that's all right. Just following those edges. And then we'll add the highlights and shadows to the white, and then we'll fully fill in the iris. Okay. So there's the white of the eye. Bearing in mind our light source, there's going to be some brightness over on this side. But the edge would be going into shadow because that's going into the eye. And then underneath will be in highlight as before it goes into the eye, and then it goes into shadow on that back side. Same thing over here, although in theory you wouldn't actually be able to see much, but we're going to anyway. Right, just that little bit under the eye, and then we'll have that back side going into shadow. Alright, back to the iris. I want to make sure it's looking at us. So I'll draw the pupil on both sides. You want it to be a little bit more towards the middle than it would seem. It might look a little cross-eyed when you do it, but trust me, you want it more in that middle. Again, because it's a cartoon, I typically will draw all the way around. I usually don't when I'm drawing something a little bit more realistic. I leave the top black where the eye would be blocking that, but since we've drawn in the whites of the eyes, I'll fill the whole iris in. And you just do that circle around the pupil. So I'm going to finish drawing this out just with these sort of sketchy lines, both sides, and I'll be right back to add the highlights. Before we start adding the highlights and shadows, I always take the elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to come in here and clean up the edge of the pupil. So I'm just going to come in here, I'm going to erase, then I'm going to select inverse, and I'm going to come back through and I'm going to draw a little bit more just to make sure the pupil has a nice clean line. I won't typically draw on the same angle. It's going to be a little bit more crosshatch. I find that a little easier. Okay, so then I'm going to select inverse this again. Reselect the elliptical marquee tool so that I can drag it to the other side and do the same thing. As long as it's selected, I should be able to manipulate it with no problem. Do the same thing, erase that out, select inverse, come back out here with the brush tool, and once again drawing at that angle. It's a little easier to make sure it's all filled in. Okay, and then I'm just going to select deselect. Put that up one more time. Make sure that's nice and clean. All right. Now, to add highlights and shadows, first things first is with the light source coming from above and to the right, there's going to be a harsh highlight opposite of that against the pupil going all the way underneath. And this is true for both eyes. Harsh highlight against the pupil going all the way underneath. It's kind of like with a coffee cup, right? A cup or anything that has a recess. You have the side that's closest to the light source goes into shadow, but the opposite edge will catch the light. All right, so then on this side, you're going to have highlight on the side of the light source. It fades into shadow as it gets to the edge of that pupil. Running into the highlight we've already put around the other side. And then, you know, the edge of the pupil would also be in shadow. Always darkens out for animals and humans. Primarily humans, since that's kind of what we're mimicking here. So bringing that over, fading that out. So harsh highlight underneath, and then the rest of this is kind of in shadow. You're certainly going to have this tapering off, and you want a brighter shadow on this section than you want above, but it still needs to be not as bright as the rest of this. And then above, you know, just sort of filling that out. And then if we need to brighten up, you know, this sort of section that's in highlight, we can easily do that. And then the same thing over here, working with a little less space in the area that's highlighted. But same idea. Right. Highlight all the way underneath. Allowing that to taper off as it comes to the edge. And then on this side, start your shadowing process and then shadow it even more up above. Now, I'm going to brighten up just this spot, both here and here. Just this bit, right? Just filling it in more, we'll brighten it up. Okay. And then we're going to add one of the most important things, which is the light flare. The light flare is just in white. I'm going to come in here, take the elliptical marquee tool, and in the highlighted section of the eye, create a little circle that pushes into the pupil where we're just going to edit and fill the foreground color, drag it to the other side and do the same thing roughly in the same spot. And fill foreground color. That light flare on the eye, it's where that sunlight or whatever would be hitting it. Yeah. And there we go. It's a little rhino. Alright, so that's how you draw a rhino. I hope that's helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I've done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.